You're standing at the edge of a frozen slope in the Ural Mountains. The wind is the only sound. 9 tent stakes are still in the snow, but the tent itself has been cut open from the inside. 9 people are gone, and what happened to them has never been fully explained. This is the story of the Dyatlov Pass incident. You've probably heard the name before, but the real answer is far stranger than the legend. In late January 1959, a group of 9 experienced hikers set out into the Ural Mountains of the Soviet Union. They were led by a 23-year-old engineering student named Igor Dyatlov. All of them were skilled outdoorsmen. Most were students. One was a veteran of the Second World War. They were not amateurs. They knew snow. They knew cold. They knew how to survive.
So why didn't they? On the 1st of February, the group made camp on the slope of a mountain the local Mansi people called Kholat Syakhl. Translated, it means dead mountain. They had already named it that, long before anyone died there. Keep that detail in your mind. It matters later. That night, something happened inside that tent. Something violent enough that the hikers sliced through the canvas from the inside rather than exit through the door. They ran out into sub-zero temperatures. Some were barefoot. Some wore only socks. Temperatures that night dropped below 30 degrees Celsius, and still they ran. Search parties found the campsite weeks later. What they found made no sense. The bodies were scattered across the mountainside, some more than a kilometer from the tent. 2 of them were found near the remains of a small fire, wearing almost nothing. 3 more were found further up the slope, as if trying to return to camp. And 4 were found months later, buried under 4 meters of snow in a ravine.
Here's where the story turns from tragedy into mystery. The forensic examiner assigned to the case, Boris Vozrozhdeny, documented injuries that didn't match a simple fall or exposure. 2 of the hikers had fractured skulls. One had a fractured skull and a fatal injury to the chest. Another was missing her tongue and eyes. The injuries to the chest were severe enough that Vozrozhdeny compared the force involved to that of a car crash. But there was no car. There was no cliff steep enough to cause it. And there were no other footprints in the snow. Think about that for a second. Massive internal injuries. No external wounds. No signs of a struggle. No sign of another person. The Soviet investigation quietly closed the case in 1959. Their official explanation was vague. A compelling natural force. No further detail. No further explanation. The files were sealed. And for over 3 decades, they stayed that way.
That silence is exactly what turned a tragedy into folklore. When investigators don't explain, people fill in the blanks themselves. And they did. Soviet secret weapons testing, radiation, yeti attacks, even alien encounters. All of it spread because a 9-person expedition vanished into a mountain named Dead Mountain, and the only people who might have known the truth wrote 2 words and moved on. But here's the twist almost nobody talks about.
Decades later,
Researchers began revisiting the case with modern tools the original investigators never had. In 2019, Russian authorities reopened the investigation under state prosecutor Andrei Koryakov. His team ran simulations, reviewed the terrain, and reconstructed the weather conditions from that night using data unavailable in 1959. Their conclusion pointed to something called a slab avalanche. Not the kind of avalanche you picture in movies, with snow tumbling down a mountain in a dramatic wave. A slab avalanche is quieter than that. It's smaller. A slab of compacted snow above a weaker layer breaks loose and slides only a short distance, but with tremendous, sudden force.
Here's why that matters. A hiker and investigative journalist named Donnie Ikar spent years building on this same avalanche theory before the official reopening, and he added a piece nobody had considered. He looked at where the tent had actually been placed. It was pitched below a slope with just enough incline to trigger this kind of slide if the snow settled wrong. Combine that with high winds that likely built up a dense slab of snow above the tent that night, and you get exactly the kind of instability that doesn't need a storm. It only needs an unlucky combination of angle, wind, and time. That would explain the panic. A slab breaking loose in darkness, slamming into the tent with the tent still zipped, would feel like an attack. It would explain why they cut their way out instead of finding the entrance. It would explain the chest and skull injuries that so puzzled Vozrozhdeny decades earlier, because that kind of blunt, compressive force is exactly what a heavy, compacted slab of snow can produce, especially against people lying down inside a collapsed tent. But why would trained, experienced hikers run into sub-zero cold instead of stopping to recover the tent, or grab boots, or build shelter nearby? This is where the human part of the story becomes just as important as the physical part. Under extreme, sudden threat, the brain doesn't reason the way it does in calm conditions. It reacts. Psychologists studying acute stress responses have long documented how a perceived life-threatening event can override rational, in-the-moment decision-making almost entirely. In the dark, half-buried, hearing your tent collapse around you with no way to know what caused it, the instinct isn't to grab your boots. It's to get away, immediately. That single decision, made in a fraction of a second under real fear, is enough to explain almost everything that came after it. So the story isn't really about a mysterious force on Dead Mountain. It's about how ordinary human instinct, combined with an unlucky slope and a freak weather pattern, produced a tragedy that looked, to investigators without modern data, like something impossible.
And maybe that's the part of this story that should unsettle you the most. Not the mystery, the explanation. Because it means you don't need a monster, or a secret weapon, or a cover-up to end up in a situation exactly this severe. You just need the wrong slope, the wrong wind, and one moment where your body decides to move before your mind has time to think it through. You already know what that feels like, in smaller ways. The jolt awake from a loud noise before you even register what it was. The flinch away from movement in your peripheral vision before you know what it is. Your body is always one step ahead of your reasoning. Built that way because for most of human history, hesitation was the more dangerous choice.
9 hikers on a mountain called Dead Mountain didn't hesitate. And for exactly that reason, their case sat unsolved for 60 years,
mistaken for something supernatural, when it was really something profoundly, quietly human. Let's go back to the beginning, because the details of who these 9 people were make the ending land differently. Igor Dyatlov wasn't just the group's leader. He was the kind of person other hikers trusted with their lives, literally. He had already led several successful expeditions into remote, unforgiving terrain. He designed his own gear when the equipment available in the Soviet Union wasn't good enough. He was methodical, careful, the opposite of reckless. Among the group was Lyudmila Dubinina, a 20-year-old engineering student known for her toughness on the trail. There was Semyon Zolotaryov, older than the others at 37, a war veteran who had survived combat most of his younger companions couldn't imagine. There was Yuri Yudin, who actually started the trip with the group, but turned back early due to illness. He would spend the rest of his life as the only member of that expedition who lived to tell people what the mood was like in those first few days. By all accounts, spirits were high. Nobody sensed danger. Nobody hesitated at Dead Mountain's name.
Should that name have warned them? Probably not. Names like that exist all over the world, attached to places that are simply remote or difficult, or historically treacherous in some mundane way, not cursed. The Mansi people who named it likely did so because the terrain was barren and hard to survive in, not because of any specific catastrophe. But once 9 people die there, a name like Dead Mountain stops being a coincidence in the public imagination. It becomes a punchline in every retelling. That's not evidence. That's just how stories work. Now think again about that tent. Investigators found it still staked into the snow, still standing, but sliced open in multiple long cuts from the inside. Not the door, the side of the tent. This detail alone fueled decades of theories, because it doesn't look like an accident. It looks like an escape. And in a sense, it was. Just not from what people assumed. Picture the scene the way modern reconstructions describe it. The hikers had already dug into the snow to level a platform for the tent, a completely normal practice for winter mountaineering. That act, digging into the slope, is exactly what can destabilize a weak layer of snow sitting above a stronger layer beneath it. Add hours of wind depositing fresh snow onto that disturbed area, and you build what avalanche researchers call a slab, a cohesive block of snow with almost nothing holding it in place. It doesn't need a steep slope to move. It doesn't need a loud rumble. It can release with a slope angle so gentle that survivors of similar incidents elsewhere have described it as feeling like being hit by a wall, not buried by a landslide. That's the mechanism the 2019 Russian investigation, led by prosecutor Andrei Kuryakov, pointed to after 60 years of silence. And that silence deserves its own explanation.
Why would a government sit on a case for decades instead of simply stating Avalanche and moving on? Partly bureaucracy, partly Cold War secrecy, since the region wasn't far from restricted military areas, and any inquiry into unexplained deaths near sensitive terrain would have been handled cautiously by default. And partly because, frankly, a compelling natural force sounded almost as strange as saying nothing at all. It answered no one's questions. It just ended the paperwork.
So the mystery didn't grow because something supernatural happened on that mountain. It grew because an institution failed to communicate an explanation clearly, and human curiosity does not tolerate a vacuum. Fill in enough blanks with rumor, repeated over 60 years, across a Cold War-era information blackout, and you get exactly the kind of legend the Dyatlov Pass incident became. Here's the part worth sitting with.
Even Donnie Eicher's investigation, the one that built the most detailed civilian case for the slab avalanche theory, didn't erase the tragedy. It reframed it. The chest fractures, the skull injuries, the tongue and eyes missing from one of the last bodies recovered, likely a result of exposure and scavenging animals after months buried in a ravine, not violence. Every detail that once looked impossible has a corresponding, mundane, physical explanation once you know to look for it. That's not a coincidence. That's what happens almost every time humans mistake an unfamiliar physical process for something sinister. The pattern recognition part of your brain isn't built to say, "I don't know." It's built to guess, quickly, using whatever explanation feels most available. In 1959, supernatural or secret weapon felt more available than a rare, quiet avalanche variant nobody had studied yet. In 2026, watching this same story unfold, you have the advantage of decades of accumulated data that Vozrozhdeny and the original 1959 investigators simply didn't have access to. That gap between what looks impossible and what is simply unfamiliar is worth remembering, because you run into smaller versions of it constantly. A strange noise in your house at night, a symptom your doctor hasn't explained yet, a decision someone made that seems irrational until you learn the pressure they were under. The instinct to reach for the most dramatic explanation is almost always faster than the instinct to ask what ordinary process might produce the same result. 9 people on Dyatlov Mountain didn't have the luxury of time to ask that question. They had seconds. And in those seconds, forged by instinct built over hundreds of thousands of years of human survival, they did the only thing that made sense to a mind under that kind of sudden, crushing pressure. They ran. You're standing at the edge of a frozen slope in the Ural Mountains again. But this time you're not looking for a monster. You're looking at the same instinct that lives in you, waiting for the one moment it might matter